Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Martin at Marquette University. I'm the founding secretary treasurer of the Society for the History of Children and Youth and a past president. Today, I'm here with several colleagues as part of the Origins Project, in which we're trying to have some loosely defined oral histories of the Society's past, especially the first few years of its existence, and as well as some of the challenges facing it in the last few years. This is the 20th anniversary coming up next year of our first conference at Marquette. And so today we have with us a few people who were either grad students or very early career folks at the founding of the organization. I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves. Melissa, why don't you start?
All right, hi everybody. I'm Melissa Klapper. I'm professor of history and director of women's and gender studies at Rowan University, which is in Glassboro, New Jersey. And I have been involved with the Society since I actually was at that first founding conference at the Benton Foundation in August of 2000. And I'm a little hesitant to say in Jim Martin's presence that I've been a member every year since. I certainly have meant to be, but I know he has the list somewhere, and it's possible that I missed a year here or there, especially somewhat earlier on. But this is one of I have two sort of research homes, American Jewish history and the history of childhood and youth, and I'm really happy to be here. And it's been a real pleasure to see the growth of the Society over the past 20 years and to, I hope, play some small part in that.
Rebecca.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rebecca Schweinitz. At that first conference, I was a grad student at the University of Virginia and have been happy to grow up intellectually and otherwise with the Society for the History of Children and Youth. I think I too have been a member every year and have attended all but one conference when I couldn't travel because I was about to give birth. So I think that excuses me. I had the chance to serve on the executive committee for a few years. And this has been a really important organization for me, both professionally and personally.
And Pat.
Well, I'm Pat Ryan. I'm program coordinator of childhood and social institutions at King's University College at Western University in London, Ontario. Past president of the Society. I currently edit the SHCY.org and have for a long time been involved in helping the Society communicate with its members. I think I completed my dissertation in 1998. My advisor was Mike Grossberg, who also had some involvement with the Society. And so I was a young scholar when it was formed. Met Chris before finishing, and those relationships were all part of sort of, the history of childhood and youth. You didn't call yourself a history of childhood and youth. At least I'd never really heard anybody doing that when that kind of field identification was going on. But I think that that evolved over time, and I was certainly really young in my career where all these things were happening and trying to figure how I wanted to, what I wanted to call myself. So Society certainly became part of that.
What's a good, I think, transition into my first general question. A couple of you were at the original sort of exploratory conference in Washington in 2000. And then again, in 2001, we had the first conference at Marquette. Most of the people sort of founding the Society were pretty senior scholars, either full professors or late associate professors. I think I was just on the cusp of being promoted to full. And I was new to the field actually at the time. What was it like to join this senior group? Because all three of you were involved pretty early on in various kinds of responsibilities. But what was it like to be part of that group?
Well, when I went to the Benton conference, or the Benton Foundation conference, it was about 6 months before I got my doctorate. So I knew I was almost done. I had basically finished writing and I just had a few months left, mostly for formalities at that point. I was still pretty bedazzled by some of the people that I was meeting there. And I'd had that experience before, particularly at the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, where there was overlap. There were people there who had started to give presentations about girls. I distinctly remember the first Berks I went to in 1996, very early in my graduate career. I heard Jane Hunter give a talk about what was going to be her book eventually about how young, young women became girls, that book. And I did. So I actually had models pretty early on in my graduate career about people who were thinking about girls. And so that, but I was still fairly, I remember actually sitting next to Rebecca. We met at this conference. I don't know if she remembers, but I remember meeting her there and kind of looking around and thinking there was a little bit of a generation gap. There were all these senior people, and then there were a few graduate student types like us. And there weren't a whole lot of people in between, which I thought was interesting and maybe said something about, you needed either senior people to kind of strike out and say, here's this new field, and then people like us who didn't have anything to lose by making it our new field. And it was noticeable to me. But I'll just also say, and this has to do with how I got into the field, since the Origins Project has started, I have been racking my brains to try to figure out how it was I got to that conference. It was by invitation only. And I don't know, I don't remember who invited me, and I don't know exactly how I got there. But I had 3 different people in my life who might have been the ones who brought me in. And I wish I remember, some historian I am. These are the perils of oral history, right? I had an undergraduate advisor named Peter Bardaglio, who was in the antebellum South and the Civil War. And I had remained in touch with him after graduating from Goucher College. He is no longer in academia, but he certainly was at the time in 2000. And it's possible that he recommended me. I do think that's a possibility. He definitely recommended that when I went to Rutgers for my doctorate, I take a class with Phil Grevin, who was, a very senior, distinguished historian of the colonial New England, a writer of the Protestant temperament. I mean, he wrote a lot about child rearing, and I did take a class with him, and he was there. So it's possible that he brought me. And I also think that earlier that year, I was on a panel at the OAH about girlhood, about American girlhood, that Miriam Foreman Grinnell was the panel chair for. And it's also possible that she had something to do with it. So I don't remember, but there were, for people my generation, I started grad school in 1995 and finished in 2001. There were options to present our work, even as graduate students, at big conferences on childhood and on girlhood. I did not have trouble presenting my work in a variety of venues. Also Jewish studies venues, but in women's history conferences, I gave papers at the OAH twice. And so there was some openness to the field, even at that stage, that was showing up in larger conferences.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Peter Bardaglio had something to do with me being there as well. And I too think that there were several people who made sure I got there. I was not as far along as Melissa. I had written some of my dissertation, but I was definitely more in the beginning stages. And it was really, super helpful to get connected to this community of scholars, mostly senior scholars, who were so incredibly encouraging and excited about the work that, I was starting to do. Kind of shifted from U.S. women and gender history and was exploring this field that wasn't even a field yet, and starting to think about childhood and youth as a way to understand, another underrepresented group in history, and as a way to, kind of bring a new lens to understanding questions about race in particular in America's past. And I think that faculty in my grad program made sure that they invited some scholars who had done work in the history of childhood and youth. So Peter Bardaglio came to campus, and somebody made sure that I got to meet personally with him. And Ning DeConnick-Smith actually came to campus as well, and I got to go to lunch with her at some point. So that was super, super helpful and encouraging. And I think between them, as well as my advisor, Cindy Aaron, who lived in DC, I think they made sure that I got there and knew about what was happening. Definitely there was a little bit of starstruck, kind of, and deer in the headlights. I wasn't exactly sure what I was doing, but it was, really fun to kind of see these folks talking about some issues and trying to grapple with what children, youth, and history meant, and what we could do, and what they hoped would come from this gathering. So it felt, really exciting to be part of that, and really like maybe I had hit on something that was worth dedicating my life to. So that was kind of, my thoughts going to that conference. And I definitely left, with this feeling that, yeah, this field matters. And maybe I had peers in grad school who weren't convinced that history of childhood and youth was really something, but I had all of these, really great scholars who had proved themselves in so many different ways, telling me that yeah, this is something. So
Just to keep the Badaglio thing going, I think I stayed at his house when I came out of the conference.
Yeah.
Pat, you weren't
The
in
theme-
Washington. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say I wasn't in Washington. I had to turn down the invitation. Chris was the one who invited me, and one of the themes that comes out of this is that there's social networks that actually define how you get started when you don't have a category to name things. And I always think it's clearer what we would call it only years later. But the networks I remember, and those were not just a matter of revisionist history where I'm just trying to, I knew what I was doing right from the beginning, because I really don't think I did in terms of categories of research or the creation of fields or anything like that. But I met, it's funny, I did meet Ray Joe Hawes and later Ray Heiner years before, probably 1993, 1994, when I met Joe. She just came and talked at Mather House at Case Western Reserve University, where we were at, the history department there. And but it was more in the framework. Certainly, Joe and Ray by the mid 1980s had clearly wanted to create something like a field. That was the nature of the collections they put together, the bibliographic work they were doing. They were envisioning it as another category of social history and done in that frame. So, they, were talking about it that way. Joe was talking about it that way. And I didn't, I thought that was interesting. That was fine. And, I was just doing my work. And incidentally, my dissertation was called Shaping Modern Youth, Social Policy and Growing Up Working Class in Industrial America. So certainly youth was part of that, but I didn't think of that in terms of fields. If you asked me what I would say I was a social policy historian, have an interest in law and education and labor and working class life. Probably wouldn't have said the history of childhood. But I think the person that probably connected me most was not meeting Joe earlier, but then in 96, I met Chris Lindenmeyer and was just putting a call out on I think it was Society for the History of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. And we were both members of that network. And then just said, hey, I want to present a paper at a conference that was up in Ottawa, a family history conference. And she and Bill Grabner and I got together. And what was cool about that is that, Chris had not written she was writing a right to childhood. It wasn't published yet. So she had done that work, the history of the Children's Bureau. But she knew what she was about and knew what she was doing. And I didn't. I had fragments of trying to put things together. And Bill Grabner was a fairly well-known social historian and had published a lot. So to me, what was great was just on my own relationships, to be able to get together with these people and share work. And that was incredibly exciting. And part of what allowed that happen was HNet. So this is prior to H Childhood, founded in 1998. HNet gave graduate students the opportunity to extend their network beyond their own department and to try to figure out what their work was about through those relationships. That I think is a major change in how the academy works today. I think the development of the field is inseparable from the creation of social media. Now, you might understand why I might argue that. It has a little bit to do with what I've been involved with. But I think that's a fact. I don't think you get a society and the journal and all of those other things. Obviously, it doesn't happen without that generation of people, without a sort of vision that Joe and Ray had. All those things are necessary, but so is the technology. I think it drew us together. I went to that 1997 conference in Odense, Denmark, that Ning put on. And I had met Bengt that year too. All these people were important. They're senior to me and knew what they wanted more than I did. I was just sharing fragments of what I was studying. You don't have those kind of international connections without the internet. I don't believe that would have happened. And those kinds of international conferences were really exciting because there were people from all over the English speaking world that were delivering their work. And that was an intense conference, that Odense conference of 1997. I'll never forget that. I was working like mad intellectually just to try to understand everything that was coming in to my head.
Well, I think that the comments you're making about those early conferences and relationships that were built there leads me to the next thing. I mean, one of the things that my thoughts about the society are centered on in some ways is how we have, what's the verb? Treated, is all I can come up with right now, grad students and early career people. My own experience was, again, I was not an early career person, but I was very new to the field. It was my second book, but I had never done anything about children's history before. And I found it very welcoming. And I always have thought we had a fairly particular and special relationship with younger scholars in our organization, certainly compared to the other ones I've been involved with. And I don't know if any of you agree with that, or if, as you have grown up, as Rebecca suggested,
Yeah.
in the last 20 years, have you noticed that about the incoming folks that came after you? We had one conference where at least a third of the people in the program are grad students.
Yeah.
And I think that might have been the year I was vice president and ran and was program director. But what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think, starting from the ground up, that there was always a consciousness that if we're going to actually build a field, we've got to pay attention to building the field, and really encouraging graduate students in the work that they're doing that's related to the history of childhood and youth. So I felt a tremendous amount of support. So Joe Haas and Gail Murray in particular, I feel like they took me under their wing and made opportunities for me. So Gail, very early on, she found out about my work and then put together a panel for the Southern and, for other kind of big name conferences, that as a grad student, I might not have felt like I could actually, do that. But there was a lot of facilitating of the scholarship and encouragement of the scholarship of grad students. And I think that's partly because, they're consciously trying to build the field. But I think it's also, this awareness, if you're studying the history of children and youth, that young people, have this energy and enthusiasm and perspective that is going to benefit, the field and the organization and the kind of work that you can imagine. So definitely in my experience, it's been, and I think we've continued that, right? And formalized some of the informal ways that the society and more senior scholars were encouraging people new to the profession and new to the field.
I agree with Rebecca, and I think just the fact that a number of graduate students were invited, however it is we were invited, to that conference. It wasn't just the two of us. There were a few other people there, including, I know Leslie Paris was there, other people who have stayed very important in the field. And for me, so I mean, those of you who, I have feet very firmly in two camps: the history of childhood and youth, but also American Jewish history. And American Jewish history is also very welcoming. Everybody there is nice. The senior people are nice, and there's an interest in taking care of graduate students. But the other two fields that I was kind of in, I was getting a doctorate in American women's history. That's what I was doing. Like many people, I came to the field partially out of a gender, women's history perspective. Women's history people were not nice, particularly. Were not so interested in graduate students if they weren't their own. Really were not so nice. And in history of education, which is also something I was more involved, I didn't stay as involved in the history of education society. Of course, there were wonderful people in that group, and there was certainly overlap. There were definitely people in our society who were also very active in history of education. But I don't think I'm the only one who sort of drifted away once there was a better option, because it just wasn't as friendly. And especially not to, in a way, kind of old school historians. There in the in the 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot of interest in the history of education, its systems and structure. And of course, that's extremely important. But to those of us who are interested, not just in childhood, but in children and children's voices, and in doing that kind of centering work with voices, the same way that women's history had done, looking for voices and creative use of sources, that wasn't as interesting to some of the people who were in charge at the time of the History of Education Society. So I know personally, I did not stay as involved in that field. I'm interested in it. I'm still interested in education. I went back to it for my book about ballet class in terms of arts education. But I do think that we have something to take pride in, that from the beginning, there was this real interest in promoting and in helping junior people, and it's been institutionalized in some really useful ways. And the fact that not only at the conferences, but also the journal regularly publishes the work of advanced doctoral students is really good. And of course, it's all blind review, so you don't really know, but the fact that it turns out that way, I think, shows a comfort level among senior or graduate students in submitting their work. They know that they're really making a contribution, and that's something that's been pretty consistent. And I do think that it's, if not exactly unique, it's still somewhat unusual to have a kind of cross-generational comedy that has been in place since the beginning.
Yeah, I like that characterization, maybe not unique, but unusual. And I definitely felt, turned off in some ways by the normal kind of hierarchical and hierarchies and posturing that often, happens, that at least, especially in that first decade, I felt like just we're not there in the society.
I felt, and this is so personal. I mean, these stories, I don't know if this explains why happened, but I would point out that I can remember working with, I was a first year or second year assistant professor at the University of Texas. And, it wasn't a slam dunk early on that we were going to get enough people to run these conferences. Mm-hmm. Jim, this might have been a conference hosted at Marquette. But Paula was leading the paper committee, and I did a lot of work sorting things through, because when we had these first conferences, people didn't know each other, so they didn't propose as panels, which is a hell of an organizational mess when you're trying to put people together. I can remember putting it on my bedroom floor and having my 2-year-old son walk all over my stacks. But the reason I tell you that story of working is that Paula Fass, I know, was someone who already was very prominent historian. And she would get on the phone and just call people and draw them in. That's kind of legwork. That's grunt work. I mean, it's just basic work. And we had a lot of people that could have done other things that decided, Paula's one example, to do really quite basic work. Jim as treasurer, Chris has done a ton, Paula did a ton. And that was making sure that the event worked, making sure that we pulled it off well. People got together and got grants for our conference, and institutional support invited them in. And people, I don't know if it was always just the older generation or what generation, people who have run this society have made smart choices. I can remember one of the early debates Chris and I had about childhood was, how are we going to name this thing? And I think I've told this story before, because I think this is actually a big decision. I didn't believe that something like childhood could work. Who's going to join that? Chris made the argument that if we defined it with any other term other than childhood and youth, if you defined it in terms of the welfare state or women or family history, you did anything like that, you would immediately exclude about 80% of the people that were interested. Jim's made this comment before. The whole field is defined by people who have childhood as sort of a secondary interest. Maybe it becomes primary later, but the whole thing rested on a notion of being a big tent, drawing everybody together. That was a very smart decision, because we got people involved, because we give out 10 prizes every 2 years now in 8 languages. And in every single prize, this phrase appears. the history of childhood and youth broadly construed. We have probably 100 on our network, and I don't know how many dues paying members that aren't historians. They are literary scholars of childhood and youth that work on children's literature historically. That group, that's a whole thing. Juvenile literature is a big deal. And they come in and they're part of this, even though a lot of us were interested in law and social policy in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. In other words, we had a big tent approach. So yes, it was generationally welcoming, but it was also Bengt van Sandine's voice saying, I care about internationalization. Like all the Swedes say that word. I love how they say that word. I'll never forget that. It isn't always the exceptionalism of America, right? He would tell us that, but it was in a friendly way, to be inclusive. And I think that's been part of our success. Yes, childhood and youth, but everybody else is welcome in education or in various ethnic studies, every language, every institution, girlhood, boyhood, you name it. And wherever that takes us, we were willing to go. And I think that was critical to success.
I think another thing that I think helped with society's success and also just its broader reach is that there's an interest in the general public about childhood and the history of childhood. I mean, there were at least 2 series, the Twain series and then the Ivan D series, that were written for a broader audience. And, maybe those books weren't going to be sold in the airport, but they were still written for a broader audience. And that also, and those were written by a combination of more senior and somewhat more junior people, at least the Ivan D books. And I think that also helped. It both garnered some more legitimacy on the field if it needed that. I don't know if it did, but it also meant that some of those books were reviewed in places like, I know my book, Small Strangers, got a review in the Christian Science Monitor. I mean, they certainly did not review Jewish girls coming of age in America, nor would I have expected them to. That's okay. But, there's an interest. There's a broad, a magazine kind of interest in the history of childhood that I think also helped. And that the big tent approach really not only supported that, but encouraged it in, I think, some interesting ways.
Yeah, and I think some of those, conscious decisions to make a welcoming space for kind of broad interdisciplinary approaches, right? So making sure that, the journal, that we have a space for thinking about policy and contemporary issues related to childhood and youth, that, there's a space for thinking about pedagogy and history teaching, right? And then the conscious and really, pointed efforts to make sure that we make this an international organization is something else that really stands out.
Yeah.
I mean, the gymnastics we went through to redefine categories of representation on the board, and decisions we made to materially support grad students, especially. I remember thinking it was a big deal to just waive the fee for grad students who were on programs. It was $25 probably, or something like that. It was a small amount, but it made all the difference, I think, as we gained recruited members in a way. One of the things that always was difficult for us was keeping membership levels to a place where we needed them to be. And I don't know what it is now. I mean, it was usually around 300 to 400, which isn't a big organization. But I wager that we probably have had thousands of different members.
Yes.
Because people do kind of come and go. It literally, I just thought of that as you were talking, Pat. Because it was annoyed us so much that people would come for a year or two, we had 2-year dues. So, and they wouldn't stick. They'd come to one conference and a much better way, healthier way of thinking about that is how many different people have belonged.
Yes.
Yeah.
The pandemic is the pandemic's hurting us a little bit.
I would think.
We're low. The whole way this thing works is that people join because of the conference, and that's great. And we've been able to keep it. Well, we had a dip in one conference area where we ran our policies different, learned a lesson about the importance of membership being tied to delegate status. But we can keep it above 300, which keeps us, Johns Hopkins, happy and gives us money for prizes and for support for conferences and the digital fellow for the online stuff and all of that. But we're down, just to answer your question, I think we're down in the low 200s now, 220 or something like that. But we'll be all right. We're so efficient economically. We don't waste a lot of money. We avoided getting into entanglements with like hotels to sign contracts. We relied on our members to hold our conferences on university campuses, where we got a lot of in-kind resources built in. And you get into those hotel contracts where you can pay out to them if you don't get enough delegates. A lot of associations didn't make that smart decision. We did, and it makes us a lot more durable. But there are some financial challenges that we face through this pandemic.
And that was part of the welcoming part of that decision we made to be welcoming, to be on a dorm, have dorms available.
Yeah.
We've always had hotels available too, usually. But I remember the first couple, I was actually a matchmaker of roommates, because we gave, a shared room as one of the, if you're on the program, you get your dorm free for 2 nights or something like this. And I literally was matching people up. I know here at Marquette, maybe at UMBC, I was doing that too. I don't remember, Chris. But it was elaborate, and as you mentioned earlier, labor intensive effort to again be welcoming and kind of ensure our future in that way.
Yeah.
How has society changed over the years from your standpoint?
Well, I think one thing that's changed is that, if anyone ever had to kind of defend the field's very existence, I just don't think that's true anymore, right? 20 years in, there's just the kind of legitimacy that you don't want to have to think about it. And I don't think anyone really does have to think about it anymore. Not just because of the explosion in publications, but also because of teaching. To reiterate a point that Rebecca made about pedagogy, think how many more courses are being taught on the history of childhood, one way or another, everywhere. And internationally, that's really important. Not only because it fulfills an important mission of the society to teach to people who aren't necessarily going to read all the books, to get students into the classroom and thinking about these issues, but it also institutionally in various departments. And that even when you work in a room full of really friendly people, I think for maybe 10, 15 years ago, I want to teach a history of childhood class might have been not an automatic sell. That was my experience. I have an incredibly supportive department. And when I first brought it up, they were like, maybe if you have I have such a heavy teaching load that there was basically eventually always going to be room to do something like that. But now I teach the history of childhood in the US regularly. And there's another colleague in my department, a small group of people. There's only 12 of us. Kelly Duke Bryant, who works on children and education in Senegal, and she teaches the history of childhood in Africa. And, she had no issue when she wanted to teach that class. And I think not just because I was there but also because by the time she's a few years behind me, and by then it was just so clear that this was an established field. So some of the groundwork that has been laid, I think, has also really, has really made a difference to the field, both inside and outside the field.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that happen. Just just this acceptance of age as a category of analysis, and the vital role that young people and the perspectives of young people play, right, is something we don't have to dig in and try to defend. The scholarship that's come out of the folks involved in this organization has really cemented this as a legitimate field of historical inquiry, right?
And I think, I'm just going to add on one more thing.
Sure.
I think that connected to that also has to do with that scholarship is just the enormous creativity that it takes to do the history of children and childhood, because especially if you want to center not just on the structures and systems of childhood, but also on the children, right, in their own voices. That takes a lot of creative kind of research, and it's recognized. People are using all kinds of sources that weren't seen as sources. In a way, it does echo kind of what happened with women's history. That, oh no, you can't write that history because they didn't say anything. They didn't leave anything behind. Well, it's just not true, right? It's just not the case. I remember hearing that when I was in graduate school. Oh no, you're never going to find any Jewish girls' diaries. Well, you know what? No one looked for them before. So they're out there. It's a challenge, certainly, but or, and Jim, think about Jim's book with the Civil War. I mean, although, the newspapers, the children wrote and produced themselves during the Civil War. I mean, these are fantastic sources, but people probably just skipped right over them before. And so the creativity of the scholarship in the field from everybody, and no matter, what age or generation, I think has also really had an impact in the best possible way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I don't know where this goes in terms of the society, because I do think, there's been a desire of the society to be interdisciplinary, but for it to be intellectually coherent, that still needs to be a historical study of childhood. I've always interpreted that, and I felt that, and I think a lot of other people have too, that what it meant was that we weren't just for professional historians. If you worked historically at all, there was a place for you there. And we've always been sort of ambitious in trying to include that. But there is that sort of research tradition of, if you're not engaged in historical work, there's a discontinuity in the conversation, right? So it's been important, I think, to maintain that. But there has been, outside of the society, a really significant development in other disciplines, particularly sociology, but as sociology intersects with many other disciplines, to study childhood and youth outside the medical model, outside of pediatrics and outside of developmental psychology and child psychiatry, to ask social, historical, cultural questions. And that's had a sort of sociological institutional development, and also a cultural, youth culture, literature, arts dimension to it. And that's all been important in sort of creating the kind of larger community where we might have thousands of people who have been delegates at various times. They don't necessarily even consider themselves historians, but they might have something historical they want to present, or they might be part of something where they're dabbling in that. And I think that's been a huge part of my own career, because I'm cross-appointed in history, but I've built an interdisciplinary program in childhood and youth studies. So for me, history has not been the only game in town. And in fact, not the one that paid my salary.
Yeah. So I've seen that kind of interdisciplinarity and the kind of set of, core folks versus folks on the periphery of the history of childhood and youth. Yeah, there's kind of ongoing tensions, right? Mm-hmm. And it's both a source of kind of not really problems, but something like that, but also a source of kind of creativity, right? That's allowed us to, expand and think in new ways as historians as well. So I liked your kind of positive spin earlier about, we're the big tent and we can pull this in. But I think that, I've seen this kind of ongoing, dialogue and question about I guess it forces us to keep asking, what are we and how are we relevant? Kind of on a variety of levels, right?
Yeah. I think when I was editing the journal, they didn't do historians with it, they had to be writing with a historical sensibility. That's kind of, I think, what you were saying, Pat. Is that's how you pull people in. They don't have to be doing straight history, but certainly, and that is one way to get, I think, scholars from doing Africa and other parts of the country. Often they're coming out of somewhat different traditions of scholarship. What about within the society, like in terms of process and institutional history? What have from your 3 points of view, have you seen as the biggest challenges facing the society internally? Again, when decisions were made, what were some of we didn't really have big fights, I don't think, but we did certainly have serious discussions about things. And then what, depending on where you were in the society at the time, what do you recall about those?
So I have not been on the executive, the big executive committee the way the others have. I've been on award committees multiple times for the book prize, for article prizes. So I'm a little less privy to that information. But my impression as someone who is always interested and involved and sometimes served on lower level committees was that this was a very well governed society where, again, it mattered that people kind of liked each other. Yeah. I think that really made a difference. There was both a common sense purpose, but also kind of just people liked each other. So to me that was a positive. But I did occasionally hear, so usually at conferences when it was like an in-person sitting around with a cup of coffee kind of thing, that there were some people who felt that they were there. They did not feel excluded exactly, but especially until relatively recently, there might have been some concerns about like the clique that runs it all, right? The same people have been in positions of leadership for a while. I think that's less true. I think that is probably a pretty natural progression in any, early, and especially, and in a way it shows exactly as you've said, Pat, and as Jim said in one of the other Origins Project series, like the people who were involved early did a lot of work and they didn't want to just give it up. They wanted to see the fruits of their labors, which was completely justifiable. But I think that might have been a challenge, but my impression, this is very impressionistic, is that it is somewhat less so in the past 5 to 6 years. As there's been, there has been turnover. There's different, the journal's been through a couple of rounds of editors now. Yeah. There's been different people in charge of some of the conferences. There's, the people who were graduate students and early career people 20 years ago are now mid to senior people. And so there's been some, I think it's less of an issue and it's more of a growing pain. But I would actually be interested to hear, for those of you who are in higher leadership positions, if that ever was noticeable from the higher ranks.
I'd say so. I think part of it is like, folks who are involved in building from the ground up, something together and who, again, kind of genuinely really like each other. The conference and things have been, and every 2 years is kind of a family reunion, right? But yeah, I've seen it. I mean, again, I've been a little bit more on the outside the last 5 years, in part because of, family things. So it seems like there are new people and that there's less of that kind of inbreeding. I guess I know that we were really concerned when
we left that behind long ago, Rebecca.
When Jim was going to be both president and still an editor of the journal, right? Yeah. And that was a really hard decision, but we felt like in order to really have the journal where we wanted it to be moving forward, that we needed to make that decision.
Well, you needed an editor, and no one else was asking to do it, so that was
you just called it. Yeah, I mean, that would be my answer to your question, is that I think Melissa has really named a theme that's important, but this is an issue for all small nonprofit organizations. The positions on the executive, but particularly the presidency, this is a working president. You have to do a lot of work, and I don't think people are banging down the doors if they know what it is to actually do that job. It's not easy. So there's.
And the same was true for the executive committee too. Like who is actually going to do the work, and we need people to do some serious kind of grunt work.
Good organizers, good communicators, people who value it, people who are selfless and are willing to do work that benefits others. Those things are really critical for a small group, and we've had just a wealth of people like that. And so I think one of the challenges for us is that doesn't just fall off the tree, right? Can we recruit people to make a commitment to serve the society over a long period of time? And can we propagate that ethic over decades? I think that's a challenge for all small organizations like ours. And so part of things always being within a clique is that when you're given a task and you're struggling to figure out who will do it with you, you call your friends. I'll give you a detail. Maybe this is supposed to be in the cone of silence, but what the heck? I'll just tell. One of the things that the president does, it's a pretty important task, is name who will be running the nominating committee. So the nominations for the president actually picks someone to run that, and then no one on the executive is really part of forming that nomination. It's somebody else. It's a really good part of our Constitution. I was very thoughtful. I went out and got Tom Axelson, who wasn't part of the group, and Tom's a Swede, and Tom said, he was very honest. Oh, who do I ask? What do I do? I said, Tom, I don't want to know. Don't ask someone that you think that I want you to ask or whatever, right? So Melanie Tippett is a Brit and was not in that group. She's a senior scholar and very well known, going to be president next. She's not part of it. So that my point is that you can consciously say, I'm going to reach out beyond people I know, but it is really hard because you have to cold call people.
Yeah, and we also, I think we, after a while also made kind of conscious decisions about, okay, we need specific, to think about representation on the board, right? And not do this in ways that are so comfortable, but really kind of, develops some relationships and get outside of our comfort zone. And I can remember some conversations too about just, thinking about the people who come to conferences, every time. And let's consciously decide, like, okay, none of us are going to be on the same panel next time, but we're going to reach out and pull in some new people.
Yeah.
Which again, takes more work.
Yeah. And I think we talked constantly about it in the early years about who's doing what and can we sustain another kind of committee? Can we have all those there's only one book award, but all those article awards? Because you have to get, 3 people to be on those committees all the time. And I think we were fairly careful about expanding the service requirements of the organization until we felt pretty good about being able to fill those slots.
Yeah. I was on the nominating committee one year, but at least 10 years ago, at least I have to look at my CV to find out. And that year there were, discussions not only about, really making sure there's always graduate student representation, which had always been of interest to the leadership, but really solidifying it in a way that it now is. But also to, we need to internationalize, which, is a word that we've all used already. And I do think it is a really important feature of a society, but in some ways it's easier said than done. And there's some, and then there's some countries that have always had, great representation, like Australia and Sweden, but then how you find people who are working in this field in other areas who might just not know about this. That year, the nominating committee really tried to find people who were doing the work, but might not even ever have heard of us because they were in France and just, hadn't crossed their desk before.
Well, and the obvious example for that is Germany. Yeah. And without being too blunt about it, but, they don't need us. And what I mean by that is they don't need to join an American or an English speaking organization. That there's plenty that they can do. And so there's a lot of literature on childhood historically in German. And so making that bridge where we're able to include German scholars is not as easy for us. Whereas other multi-language links, Spanish being the obvious example, is a much easier thing for us to pull off in terms of being multilingual. And of course, Scandinavian languages all fit in too, because of the way that things are organized. So it's not all only about what does the society want to do, but sort of where are the opportunities? It was, I met a group of folks at a conference in Dublin a number of years ago. And Sarah Ann Buckley was one of the people that I met. She was one of the organizers. She's the host for the conference in Galway this summer. And they had a whole group in Ireland. That was really easy to interact with, to make connections. and not just because of my name. It was just a really easy group to get to know, to come, to give a paper, to talk them, to make friendships, and I'm still in touch with those people. That was really easy to do, but not all international connections are going to work that way. Language matters, geopolitics matters, institutional development matters, common narratives and questions matter. And so you can't just say, we're going to be international and have it happen. There are opportunities and limits to our ability to do that. But I think we've done it, frankly, I think we've done an awesome job.
Well, I know there have also been some challenges with that in terms of location of our conferences, right? So we've tried to be really conscious of, where are our conferences? How is this, facilitating the attendance of folks who might not otherwise be able to come? But then how is it creating challenges when university budgets are so strapped and faculty may not have the funds to travel internationally, or folks who are international to come here? Yeah, I don't know how you guys how you're thinking about that more recently. After Australia, and then we're on Zoom now for but
I don't think we've ever just fallen into a way of doing something. We're going to stick to it no matter what. My other organizations are very much traditional and do things certain ways, and I suppose there are some things that we have tried to figure out ways to do the same way all the time because it's easier, but have not usually fallen into ruts. Well, we should probably begin wrapping this up. And I want to ask just one more general question about your thoughts about society itself. And maybe like the greatest challenge you think it faces going into our second 20 years.
I think one of the interesting open questions is, this was touched on earlier, is, kind of how many people who work in this field, all those, the 1,000 people who have come and gone, see the history of children and youth as their primary field now, which I think is possible to see in a way that maybe it wasn't 20 years ago. And we want to get more of those people. Because I think that's part of the issue. Like if you want to build a field, we built this great institutional base, this, just amazing blossom of scholarship over the past 20 years, the personal relationships, the mentorship. All of this is wonderful and important, and long may it continue. But if it's always most people's secondary field, that's a built-in issue. And, and I'm saying this is somebody for whom it has not always, I don't see it as a secondary field, but I have two different fields and I kind of go back and forth between them. And, for a long time, when I was working on my book about activist Jewish women, I was less involved for a little while. I was always a member, but I was somewhat less involved because I wasn't presenting at conferences. I went to most of them, but because I was doing something else. I don't think of it as a secondary field, but I think a lot of people still do in a way. And that's why membership comes and goes, because people don't give up their membership and whatever they think of as their primary thing, but they might, and especially when economic circumstances dictate that. And I don't know if that should be a goal of a society or a goal of the field. Like, we are here now, we've been here long enough that we should be your number one. And there's no way to, of course, enforce that, but in terms of just how people conceptualize their own place in the field, I think that is a open question maybe, and a challenge going forward.
Yeah, I'm torn on that too. I still see, a number of scholars who are doing really great work on the history of childhood and youth who really had never thought about, identifying themselves that way, and maybe not even aware of some of the really important work that they should be. So I think that's an ongoing challenge and question.
I think identity will follow relationships and the quality of the work. And I think if we just continue to focus on really high, our conferences have been so well organized. Just hats off to all the people that have done that. And if we do those well, and the journal is well run, and we can, if the website is well done, and we have a presence on Twitter and have in other words, if we're doing all of those things well, and the quality of the work is strong, then I think identity will follow it. And I think that it's, by the way, I think it's okay wherever that path leads. I think it's okay if this is kind of I'm not trying to up the ante on my point, but this is how I'm different, I guess. It's not clear to me that there's an essence in something called being a historian, right? In other words, even the way universities are organized is changing rapidly. And some disciplines are the newest disciplines we have who have the strongest sense of their identity. Economics and psychology have very strong senses of what they're about, and they're successful in the professions. That doesn't mean that there isn't really important things going on in all sorts of areas that are outside of those sort of scientifically organized fields. And I think it's okay to have an unknown about where history is going, where social research is going, because political, cultural, social questions that childhood is central to, they're not going away. We're not going to wake up tomorrow and suddenly childhood and youth will, in fact, in the world be unimportant. So I don't think we have to be insecure about where this might take us. It just might change how it's defined and categorized, and that's okay. That's okay. That's going to be all right, as long as we keep working and producing really strong, important work. That's where it's at.
And I think teaching is also important and something that we should not, discount. I mean, one thing that we can think about, maybe, for future conferences or just something to think about is, because there's so many more people teaching the history of childhood and youth or children in some way, like who's the audience for that? Maybe teachers, people who are planning to be teachers should be taking classes like this. I mean, I go out and I recruit some teacher candidate types sometimes to say, this is, you would be interested in this. You want to teach children. Well, come learn about children, historically. At Rowan, at my institution, a lot of history majors are planning to be teachers. So there's fertile cross-pollination, pollination possibilities there. And I think that should be, it is our job also as historians, as academics, not to just stay in the ivory tower and to also, be available to think of and talk through issues around children and childhood out in various public settings, which I do think lots of people who belong to the society do. But that is something that's important, and it's important work. And I think that's something like a path that could maybe institutionally be explored a little further, maybe. I don't know if I have any definite ideas, but I think that's something that will, because it's exactly as Pat says, right? The questions, whatever they are, whether they're policy questions or anything else, are not going away, right?
Yeah, and I think, one of the challenges is how to do this in ways that fit with current technology and changing technologies, right? And so I think some of the things that we're doing along those lines are important. So, but those are gonna happen. And how are we, as a society, engaging in those public ways with our scholarship in ways that are accessible, right? Including to young people, right? Who I think could, especially, young people are always important in politics and in contemporary issues, and increasingly so, I would argue, in the modern world as technology makes this more available. But
I think our whole environment is changing so much. Just reflect for a moment on your own media consumption behavior and how it's changed in the last 20 years. And it's not just, it started changing around 2000, or it's not just the smartphone. It's everything. I mean, I was reading the Houston Chronicle. I actually emailed Jim about this. But the New York Times, on my iPad, the nature of the stories they're producing, they don't do it all the time. Some of it is just an old-fashioned story on an iPad. But every once in a while, they're doing this investigative journalism with the visual aspects of what they're producing that are stunning. Some of the graphics integrated with the stories, the way people are scrolling, things come onto your screen. To me, that's journalism, but it ought to be history too.
Yeah,
and ought to be thinking about producing journals like that.
Yeah. What does it mean to be, publishing history of childhood and youth in this new era, right? What does it mean to host a journal and to
Yeah.
promoting scholarship.
Yeah, and also to think about documentation, I'm going to say this like for the future, when you have the creative energies of a lot of younger people on TikTok and not writing diaries, not that those are mutually exclusive, but they, like, what does that mean functionally for people who are historians later, down the road? I dread to think it's good for someone. Like, I think I'm too old to like wrap my mind around what that kind of research challenge is going to be, in 40 years from now or whatever. But that's another, not just media consumption, but also media production. What are records? What kinds of sources are young people producing today? How are we going to be able to document that in the future?
Well, I think on that wearying and exhilarating note, I'm going to thank Pat, Rebecca, Melissa for joining me on this very interesting and little bit of a walk into the past, but mainly really thinking about the future. So thanks for doing this.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Hey guys, it's really good to see all of you. Yes. Through all this, we haven't been able to travel, but I just really like just being able to see you and check in.
Yeah.
And we won't be able to be in person in 2021, but I look forward to the next time.
Good to see you.